Marcus Chan had always been invisible. Not literally, of course, but in every way that mattered to the Galactic Defense Corps. At 28, he was the oldest recruit in basic training, the shortest soldier in his unit, and the only human who had been rejected from active duty 3 times before finally being accepted. The other species in the Alliance barely noticed him. The towering Craxians, with their 4 arms and stone-like skin, would look right through him during briefings. The swift Valari, with their cat-like reflexes and piercing yellow eyes, dismissed him as too slow. Even the intellectual Zephyrians, despite their respect for human ingenuity, seemed to forget he existed the moment he left their sight. Marcus didn't mind being overlooked. He had grown up that way on Earth, in the overcrowded slums of Neo-Singapore, where being noticed usually meant trouble. His small frame and quiet nature had kept him alive when bigger, louder kids had fallen to gang violence or corporate exploitation. He had learned early that survival often meant becoming a shadow. The war against the hegemony had been raging for 3 years when Marcus finally earned his place aboard the battleship Redemption. The enemy was unlike anything the galaxy had seen before. They called themselves the Dominion, but everyone else knew them as the hegemony, a collection of machine-enhanced beings who had consumed 17 star systems and showed no signs of slowing down. The hegemony's technology was superior to anything the Alliance possessed. Their ships could phase through normal matter, making them nearly impossible to hit. Their soldiers were cybernetic nightmares that felt no pain and knew no fear. Most terrifying of all, they had a way of turning captured enemies into more of themselves, adding their knowledge and skills to the collective consciousness. Marcus had been assigned to maintenance duty aboard the Redemption, fixing air recyclers and cleaning waste systems while the real soldiers prepared for battle. He worked in the forgotten corners of the ship, crawling through service tunnels and repair shafts that were too small for the larger alien crew members. During his 3rd week aboard, Marcus discovered something the ship's sensors had missed. While performing routine maintenance on a ventilation hub near the engine room, he heard a sound that didn't belong. It was faint, almost inaudible over the hum of the ship's systems. But Marcus had spent his childhood listening for danger in the walls of abandoned buildings. The sound was rhythmic, like breathing, but with a mechanical undertone that made his skin crawl. Marcus followed the sound through a series of maintenance tunnels until he found its source. Behind a false panel that hadn't been opened in years, something was waiting. The creature was no larger than Marcus himself, which explained how it had remained hidden. Its body was a horrific fusion of flesh and machinery, with cables running through exposed muscle tissue and glowing circuits embedded in what had once been skin. It was a hegemony infiltrator, a spy designed to gather intelligence before the main fleet arrived. Marcus understood immediately that he was looking at death. The infiltrator's head turned toward him with a servo whine, and red optical sensors locked onto his position. In less than a second, it would send an alert to the hegemony fleet, revealing the Redemption's location and ensuring the destruction of everyone aboard. But Marcus had spent his entire life being underestimated, and he had learned to use that to his advantage. Instead of running or calling for help, he did something the infiltrator's programming had never anticipated. He attacked. The maintenance tool in Marcus's hand was nothing more than a plasma cutter designed for removing stubborn bolts, but it proved surprisingly effective against cybernetic flesh. The infiltrator tried to dodge, but it had been designed for stealth, not combat. Its reaction time was fast, but Marcus was faster. The fight lasted only seconds. The infiltrator's first swing would have taken Marcus's head off if he hadn't ducked at exactly the right moment. Its second attack never came because Marcus had already driven the plasma cutter through its central processing unit. As the creature collapsed, sparking and twitching, Marcus realized he had just accomplished something that elite Craxian commandos had failed to do in dozens of previous encounters. He had killed a hegemony operative in single combat. But instead of celebrating, Marcus felt only a cold certainty that this was just the beginning. The infiltrator had been aboard the ship for weeks, possibly months. It had been gathering data, learning the Alliance's tactics and weaknesses. Even though it was dead, the damage might already be done. Marcus searched the creature's body and found what he was looking for. A quantum transmitter, small enough to fit in his palm but powerful enough to send messages across star systems. The device was warm to the touch, indicating recent use. The infiltrator had been reporting back to the hegemony fleet. Instead of immediately alerting the ship's security, Marcus made a decision that would change the course of the war. He pocketed the transmitter and began examining the infiltrator's other equipment. There was a data storage unit, a cloaking field generator, and something else that made his blood run cold. The infiltrator had been carrying detailed schematics of every major Alliance ship, including the Redemption. It knew the location of weapon systems, shield generators, and most importantly, the command bridge. The hegemony hadn't just been gathering intelligence, they had been preparing for a surgical strike that would decapitate the Alliance fleet in a single, devastating attack. Marcus looked at the dead infiltrator, and then at the transmitter in his hand. An idea began to form in his mind, dangerous and desperate, but possibly brilliant. The hegemony had made their first mistake by ignoring him, by assuming that a small human maintenance worker posed no threat. He was going to make sure it was their last mistake. Marcus began to work, using skills he had learned in the slums and knowledge he had gained from years of fixing broken equipment. The transmitter could be modified, its signals altered and redirected. The infiltrator's cloaking device could be adapted for human use. Most importantly, the data storage unit contained detailed information about hegemony technology and tactics. For the first time in his life, Marcus Chen was going to make sure he was noticed. But not by his allies, by his enemies. And he was going to use their own arrogance against them. Marcus spent the next 48 hours in the deepest parts of the ship, places where even the maintenance crews rarely ventured. He had told his supervisor that he was tracking down a persistent air leak, which wasn't entirely a lie. The infiltrator's hiding place had indeed compromised the ship's atmospheric systems. Working by the light of a single plasma torch, Marcus carefully dissected the alien technology he had recovered. The hegemony's engineering was unlike anything he had encountered before. Where Alliance technology relied on separate components working together, hegemony systems seemed to blend organic and mechanical elements into seamless wholes. The quantum transmitter was the key to his plan. By analyzing its communication protocols, Marcus discovered that the hegemony used a complex identification system that prevented unauthorized access to their networks. Each device had a unique signature that was nearly impossible to replicate. Nearly impossible, but not entirely. Marcus had spent years jury-rigging broken equipment with whatever materials he could find. The skills that had kept him fed in the slums of Earth now gave him insights that the Alliance's best engineers had missed. The infiltrator's data storage revealed even more troubling information. The hegemony wasn't just planning to attack the Redemption, they were preparing to assault the entire Centauri defense line, the Alliance's last major stronghold. The attack would come in 3 waves, designed to overwhelm the defenders through sheer coordination and superior technology. But Marcus also found something else in the data, something that made him smile for the first time in weeks. The hegemony's greatest strength was also a potential weakness. Their cybernetic collective consciousness allowed for perfect coordination, but it also meant that false information injected into their network could spread like a virus. Marcus began to work on his counterstrike. Using components salvaged from the infiltrator and spare parts from his maintenance kit, he built a device that could mimic the hegemony's communication protocols. It wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. He only needed it to work once. While he worked, Marcus thought about the battle that was coming. The Redemption was one of the Alliance's most powerful ships, but it was also a symbol. If it fell, the morale of the entire fleet would collapse. The hegemony knew this, which was why they had spent so much effort infiltrating it. On the 3rd day, Marcus was ready. He had modified the transmitter to send false data back to the hegemony fleet, information that would hopefully disrupt their attack plans. But he knew that sending a single transmission wouldn't be enough. He needed to get closer to the enemy, to strike at them when they least expected it. That opportunity came sooner than he had anticipated. The ship's alarms began wailing just as Marcus was putting the finishing touches on his device. The hegemony fleet had arrived ahead of schedule, emerging from hyperspace at the edge of the star system. Marcus made his way to the observation deck, keeping to the maintenance corridors to avoid the chaos that had erupted throughout the ship. Through a small viewport he could see them, dozens of hegemony vessels that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. They moved with an eerie precision that spoke of their collective consciousness. The Alliance fleet was already moving to intercept, but Marcus could see that they were sailing into a trap. The hegemony ships were positioning themselves exactly as the stolen data had indicated they would. The first wave would draw the Alliance forces forward. The second wave would cut off their retreat, and the third wave would deliver the killing blow. Marcus activated his modified transmitter and began sending false coordinates to the hegemony fleet. According to his fabricated data, the Alliance ships were moving to positions they had no intention of occupying. It was a small deception, but in a battle where timing was everything, small deceptions could have enormous consequences. The effect was almost immediate. Marcus watched through the viewport as several hegemony ships altered course slightly, moving to intercept Alliance forces that weren't where they appeared to be. The change was subtle, but it created gaps in the hegemony formation that weren't supposed to exist. But Marcus knew that his electronic warfare would only work for a limited time. The hegemony's collective intelligence would eventually identify the false signals and adapt. He needed to do more than just confuse them. He needed to hurt them. The infiltrator's cloaking device gave him an idea that was so dangerous it might actually work. If he could get aboard one of the hegemony ships, he could cause damage from within. The smaller vessels in their fleet were automated, controlled remotely by the collective consciousness. If he could disrupt their control systems, he might be able to turn their own ships against them. Marcus gathered his equipment and made his way to the Redemption's hangar bay. The battle was raging outside, with both fleets trading devastating volleys of energy weapons and missile strikes. In the chaos, no one noticed a small maintenance worker climbing into an emergency escape pod. The pod was designed for evacuation, not infiltration, but Marcus had modified its systems during his years of maintenance work. He had given it better sensors, stronger engines, and most importantly, a stealth coating that would make it nearly invisible to enemy scanners. As Marcus launched from the Redemption, he activated the infiltrator's cloaking device. The combination of stealth technologies made his pod effectively invisible, a ghost drifting through the battlefield. He set course for the nearest hegemony vessel, a sleek destroyer that was coordinating attacks on Alliance frigates. The destroyer's hull was smooth and organic-looking, like the carapace of some enormous insect. There were no obvious docking ports or hangar bays, but Marcus had studied the infiltrator's data carefully. He knew that hegemony ships absorbed smaller vessels rather than docking with them. Marcus positioned his pod near what sensors indicated was a weak point in the destroyer's hull and activated the infiltrator's cutting tools. The alien technology sliced through the hegemony ship's armor like it was made of paper, creating an opening just large enough for Marcus to squeeze through. Inside the ship, Marcus found himself in a nightmare landscape of pulsing organic walls and glowing neural pathways. The hegemony vessel was as much a living creature as it was a machine, and he could feel it responding to his presence like an immune system detecting an infection. He moved quickly through the ship's corridors, following the pathways he had memorized from the stolen data. His destination was the central control node, the organic computer that connected this ship to the collective consciousness. If he could damage it, the ship would be cut off from the fleet's coordination. But as Marcus made his way deeper into the vessel, he realized that he had been wrong about one thing. The ship wasn't entirely automated. In the central chamber, surrounded by pulsing neural cables and glowing displays, stood a figure that had once been human. The hegemony commander turned to face Marcus, and he saw with horror that it was someone he recognized. Captain Sarah Mitchell had been one of the Alliance's most decorated officers before her ship had been captured 6 months ago. Now she was something else entirely, her body enhanced with cybernetic implants and her mind connected to the collective. "You cannot stop what has already begun," she said, her voice carrying an electronic harmony that spoke of multiple minds speaking as one. "Your species will join us, willingly or otherwise." Marcus looked at what Captain Mitchell had become and felt a cold rage building in his chest. The hegemony hadn't just killed his people, they had stolen their very souls, turning heroes into weapons against their former allies. "Maybe," Marcus said quietly, pulling out the plasma cutter he had used to kill the infiltrator. "But you made one mistake." The cybernetic captain tilted her head, neural implants flickering with curiosity. "What mistake?" Marcus smiled grimly as he began to advance toward the control node. "You ignored me." The thing that had been Captain Mitchell moved with inhuman speed, cybernetic enhancements allowing her to cross the chamber in a single bound. But Marcus had been expecting the attack. He rolled to the side, using his small size to slip between the neural cables that filled the room. The captain's enhanced fist struck the wall where Marcus had been standing, leaving a crater in the organic material. Immediately, the ship's biological systems began to repair the damage, flesh and metal flowing together like liquid. Marcus struck back with his plasma cutter, but the captain was no longer entirely human. Her skin had been replaced with a flexible armor that deflected the energy beam. She grabbed for him with hands that ended in razor-sharp claws, forcing Marcus to dive deeper into the maze of cables and conduits. "You are brave but foolish," the captain said, her voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "Your species has impressed the collective with its ingenuity, but ingenuity without power is meaningless." Marcus didn't waste breath on a reply. He was studying the room, looking for weaknesses in the ship's design. The central control node pulsed with bioluminescent light at the center of the chamber, surrounded by dozens of neural pathways that connected it to the rest of the ship. If he could sever enough of those connections, the ship would lose its link to the collective consciousness. But first, he had to deal with the captain. She was hunting him through the cables, her enhanced senses tracking his every movement. Marcus realized that direct confrontation was hopeless. She was stronger, faster, and better armed than he was, but she was also connected to the collective, which meant she was thinking like a collective. The collective consciousness was efficient, but predictable. It analyzed threats and responded with overwhelming force. What it didn't handle well was chaos, unpredictability, and most importantly, individual initiative. Marcus began moving erratically through the chamber, not trying to escape but deliberately creating as much noise and disturbance as possible. He knocked over equipment, severed minor control cables, and triggered every alarm he could find. The ship's biological systems responded to each disturbance, trying to repair the damage and restore order. The captain pursued him relentlessly, but Marcus noticed that her movements were becoming more mechanical, more predictable. The collective was trying to coordinate not just her actions, but the ship's responses to his sabotage. The more chaos he created, the more processing power the collective had to dedicate to managing the situation. It was like a computer virus, Marcus realized. By creating multiple small problems simultaneously, he was forcing the collective to divide its attention. And while it was distracted, he could strike at the real target. Marcus feinted toward one of the side passages, drawing the captain away from the central node. As she moved to intercept him, he suddenly reversed direction, sprinting directly toward the control center. The captain realized his deception and turned to pursue, but she was a fraction of a second too slow. Marcus reached the central node and began cutting into its neural connections with his plasma cutter. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The ship's lights flickered and a subsonic vibration ran through the hull as systems began to fail. The captain screamed in rage and pain as her connection to the collective wavered. For a moment, Marcus saw something human flicker in her eyes, confusion, fear, and a desperate need for help. Then the collective reasserted control and she became a monster again, but the damage was done. Marcus had severed enough connections to isolate the ship from the fleet's coordination network. On his modified scanner, he could see the destroyer beginning to drift out of formation, its automated systems struggling to function without guidance from the collective. The captain launched herself at Marcus with desperate fury, but he was already moving. He had studied the ship's layout from the infiltrator's data, and he knew there was an emergency system that could serve his purposes. As the captain's claws raked the air where he had been standing, Marcus triggered the ship's self-diagnostic routine. The diagnostic was designed to identify and repair damage to the ship's biological systems, but Marcus had modified the infiltrator's transmitter to send false data to hegemony equipment. When the diagnostic began, it received information indicating that the entire ship was contaminated with a hostile organism, namely, Marcus himself. The ship's immune system activated with devastating efficiency. Acidic compounds flooded the air, designed to dissolve any foreign biological matter. Defensive organisms emerged from the walls, mindless creatures that existed only to destroy intruders. Most importantly, the ship began to seal itself off from the rest of the fleet to prevent the spread of contamination. The captain was partially protected by her cybernetic enhancements, but she was still partly organic. As the ship's defenses turned against her, she screamed in agony. Marcus had triggered a biological nightmare that treated everything in the ship as a potential threat. Marcus activated the infiltrator's personal shield system, an energy field that protected him from the worst of the ship's defenses. He had only minutes before the shield failed, but that was all he needed. He made his way back through the chaotic chamber toward his entry point, leaving behind a ship that was literally consuming itself. But as he reached the hole he had cut in the hull, Marcus realized that his work wasn't finished. Through the ship's transparent sections, he could see the rest of the hegemony fleet. They were still coordinated, still following their battle plan. The loss of one ship wouldn't be enough to stop them. Marcus looked at the transmitter in his hand and made a decision that terrified him. He could modify the device one more time, turning it into a weapon that would affect the entire hegemony fleet. But using it would require him to remain aboard the dying ship, and there would be no escape. The Alliance needed a victory, and sometimes victory required sacrifice. Marcus had spent his entire life being ignored and overlooked. Now, in the most important moment in galactic history, he finally had the chance to make a difference. He began reprogramming the transmitter, his fingers flying over the alien controls. Behind him, he could hear the captain's screams growing weaker as the ship's defenses overwhelmed her cybernetic systems. The destroyer was tearing itself apart, but Marcus no longer cared about his own survival. He was going to send a message to the hegemony fleet, a signal that would carry more than just false data. It would carry a virus, a piece of corrupted code that would spread through their collective consciousness like wildfire. The virus wouldn't destroy them, but it would do something worse. It would make them question their own unity. Marcus smiled as he made the final adjustments to the transmitter. The hegemony's second mistake had been underestimating human stubbornness. They were about to learn that sometimes the smallest soldier could strike the most devastating blow. He activated the transmitter and began broadcasting his virus to the fleet. Almost immediately he could see the effects. Hegemony ships began to break formation. As their collective consciousness struggled with contradictory information, some vessels turned on their own allies, their targeting systems corrupted by Marcus's signal. The Alliance fleet seized the opportunity, striking at the confused enemy with everything they had. Energy beams and missile salvos tore through hegemony ships that were no longer coordinating their defenses. For the first time in the war, the Alliance was winning a major engagement. Marcus watched the battle through the dying ship's sensors and felt a deep satisfaction. He had done it. The invisible maintenance worker had accomplished what elite commandos and brilliant strategists had failed to achieve. He had hurt the hegemony where they were strongest, in their unity. The ship shuddered around him as its biological systems finally collapsed. Marcus closed his eyes and prepared for the end, knowing that his sacrifice had saved thousands of lives and given the Alliance its first real victory against the hegemony. But death didn't come. Instead, Marcus heard a familiar sound, the whine of cutting tools and the hiss of atmosphere equalizing. Someone was cutting through the hull from outside. The rescue team that pulled Marcus from the dying hegemony ship was led by Lieutenant Commander Zara Voss, a Craxian officer whose forearms made quick work of the extraction equipment. Her stone-like face showed no emotion as she dragged the unconscious human through the emergency airlock, but Marcus caught something in her eyes that he had never seen before: respect. Marcus awoke 3 days later in the medical bay of the Redemption. His body was covered in chemical burns from the hegemony ship's defensive systems, and his lungs had been damaged by the toxic atmosphere. But he was alive, and according to the medical reports scrolling past his bed, he was expected to make a full recovery. The first visitor was Admiral Thorne, the grizzled human commander of the Centauri defense line. Marcus had never spoken to an officer above the rank of sergeant, and the Admiral's presence made him distinctly uncomfortable. "Son," the Admiral said, settling into a chair beside the medical bed, "I've been fighting wars for 30 years, and I've never seen anything like what you pulled off. The intelligence division has been analyzing your virus for days, and they still can't figure out how you managed to corrupt the hegemony's collective consciousness." Marcus tried to sit up, wincing as the movement pulled at his healing burns. "It wasn't that complicated, sir. I just gave them too much conflicting information to process at once. Like overloading a computer with too many programs running simultaneously." The Admiral smiled grimly. "Simple in concept maybe, but the execution was brilliant. You didn't just disrupt their coordination, you made them doubt themselves. Some of those ships are still floating dead in space because their crews can't agree on basic operational procedures. Over the following days, Marcus received a steady stream of visitors. Scientists wanted to understand how he had modified hegemony technology. Intelligence officers wanted detailed reports of everything he had seen aboard the enemy ship. Most surprisingly, several alien officers came to thank him personally for his actions. Commander Voss returned multiple times, bringing Marcus updates on the battle's aftermath. The Alliance had destroyed or captured nearly half of the hegemony fleet, the first major victory in 3 years of warfare. More importantly, they had recovered intact hegemony technology that was already being reverse-engineered by Alliance scientists. The collective consciousness isn't as unified as we thought, Voss explained during one visit. Your virus revealed fractures in their system, disagreements that they've been suppressing. We're learning to exploit those weaknesses. But Marcus found the attention overwhelming. He had spent his entire life avoiding notice, and suddenly everyone wanted to talk to him. Reporters requested interviews, military analysts wanted his tactical insights, and recruitment officers offered him positions in elite units. "I just want to get back to work," Marcus told Admiral Thorne during their final meeting. "I'm not officer material, sir. I'm a maintenance worker." The Admiral studied him carefully. "Son, you've earned the right to choose your own path. But I'll tell you this, the Alliance needs people who can see solutions that others miss. What you did out there, that wasn't just maintenance work. That was strategic thinking of the highest order." Marcus was eventually cleared for duty and returned to his quarters aboard the Redemption. The ship had been heavily damaged during the battle, and there was plenty of repair work to keep him busy. But something had changed in how the crew treated him. Where once they had ignored him, now they nodded respectfully when he passed. The alien crew members actually made room for him in the corridors instead of treating him like an obstacle. It wasn't just respect, Marcus realized. It was something more dangerous, expectation. People were looking at him differently, waiting for him to perform another miracle. The pressure was almost suffocating. His reputation had spread throughout the fleet. Other ships requested his assistance with technical problems, assuming that the human who had single-handedly crippled a hegemony destroyer could solve any engineering challenge. Marcus found himself traveling between vessels, helping with everything from weapon malfunctions to atmospheric system failures. During one such assignment aboard the carrier Valiant, Marcus discovered something that made his blood run cold. While performing routine maintenance on the ship's communication array, he detected an anomalous signal buried in the background radiation. It was faint and heavily encrypted, but the signature was unmistakably hegemony. Marcus spent hours analyzing the signal, using techniques he had learned while studying the infiltrator's equipment. What he found confirmed his worst fears. The signal was a tracking beacon, and it was coming from within the Alliance fleet itself. There were more infiltrators, and they had learned from the failure of the first spy. These new agents weren't hiding in maintenance shafts. They were integrated into the fleet's command structure, possibly for months or even years. They had been watching, learning, and reporting back to the hegemony leadership. Marcus realized that the Alliance's recent victory might have been deliberately allowed to happen. The hegemony could have sacrificed part of their fleet to make the Alliance overconfident, to lower their guard for a much larger attack. If that was true, then every ship in the Centauri defense line was in mortal danger. But this time, Marcus couldn't work alone. The infiltrators were too well placed and too numerous for a single maintenance worker to handle. He needed help, but he also needed to be careful. If there were hegemony agents in the command structure, then normal reporting channels might be compromised. Marcus began his investigation carefully, using his maintenance access to move freely throughout the fleet. He installed monitoring devices and communication hubs, analyzed personnel records for anomalies, and tracked the mysterious signals to their sources. What he found was worse than he had feared. The infiltrators weren't just gathering intelligence, they were actively sabotaging Alliance equipment. Weapon systems had been subtly modified to reduce their effectiveness. Shield generators had been programmed with hidden flaws that would cause them to fail at critical moments. Most terrifyingly, the fleet's navigation computers had been infected with code that would allow the hegemony to disable them remotely. Marcus realized that the Alliance was sailing into a trap that would make their previous losses look insignificant. The hegemony had spent years preparing for this moment, placing their agents and corrupting alliance systems from within. When the attack came, the fleet would be helpless. But Marcus also realized that he now had an opportunity to turn the tables once again. The infiltrators' greatest strength was also their weakness. They were connected to each other through quantum communication links, just like the hegemony fleet had been. If Marcus could trace those connections, he could identify every spy in the fleet simultaneously. Working 18-hour days in secret, Marcus built a new device based on the technology he had captured from the first infiltrator. This scanner could detect quantum entanglement signatures, the invisible threads that connected the hegemony agents to their handlers. It was delicate work, requiring precision that pushed his engineering skills to their limits. When the scanner was complete, Marcus activated it during the fleet's night shift when most of the crew was asleep. The results were staggering. 12 ships in the Centauri defense line had been infiltrated, with agents placed in positions ranging from junior communications officers to senior tactical advisors. One signature was particularly strong, indicating an infiltrator in a position of high authority aboard the fleet flagship. Marcus cross-referenced the signal with personnel records and felt his heart sink. The spy was Commander Elena Vasquez, Admiral Thorne's chief of staff and one of the most trusted officers in the Alliance. Marcus stared at the scanner readout and realized that he was facing an impossible choice. If he revealed the infiltrators' identities through normal channels, Vasquez would learn of the discovery and warn the others. But if he acted alone, he would be branded as a traitor himself. The maintenance worker who had once been invisible to everyone now held the fate of the entire Alliance fleet in his hands. And he had less than 24 hours to decide what to do with that terrible responsibility. Marcus spent the night planning his next move, knowing that one wrong decision could doom the entire fleet. He couldn't trust normal communication channels, couldn't rely on the chain of command, and couldn't even be certain which of his fellow crew members might be compromised. But Marcus had one advantage that the infiltrators couldn't account for: his invisibility. For years, people had looked right through him, treating him as part of the ship's equipment rather than a person. Now that tendency to ignore him would become his greatest weapon. At dawn, Marcus began what he privately called Operation Ghost. Using his maintenance access, he moved through the fleet like a specter, installing monitoring devices and gathering evidence of the infiltrators' activities. Each spy had been placed in a position where they could cause maximum damage when the time came. On the destroyer Vigilant, the infiltrator was the weapons officer who had been subtly miscalibrating the ship's targeting systems. On the cruiser Independence, the spy was the chief engineer who had been installing hidden vulnerabilities in the power grid. Each sabotage was small and nearly undetectable, but together they would cripple the fleet when the hegemony attack began. Marcus documented everything, building an ironclad case against each infiltrator. But he also did something more dangerous. He began to trace the communication network that connected them. The spies were part of a cell structure, with each agent knowing only their immediate contacts. But Marcus was mapping the entire network, following quantum signatures like a detective following clues. What he discovered made him realize that the situation was even worse than he had feared. The infiltrators weren't just preparing to sabotage the fleet, they were planning to capture it intact. The hegemony wanted the Alliance's ships and technology, and they had spent years positioning their agents to make that possible. The attack would begin with the infiltrators disabling key systems throughout the fleet. Then hegemony boarding parties would strike, overwhelming crews that couldn't coordinate their defenses. Within hours, the entire Centauri defense line would belong to the enemy. But Marcus also found something that gave him hope. The infiltrators' communication network had a central hub, a quantum relay that coordinated their activities. If he could locate and destroy that relay, he could sever their connections and leave them isolated and vulnerable. The relay was hidden aboard Admiral Thorne's flagship, the massive battleship Prometheus. Marcus studied the ship's schematics and realized that the device was probably concealed in the one place no one would think to look: the Admiral's personal quarters. Getting aboard the flagship would be difficult. Getting into the Admiral's quarters would be nearly impossible. But Marcus had spent his entire life finding ways into places where he didn't belong. That evening, Marcus reported for a routine maintenance assignment aboard the Prometheus. His work order was legitimate: a minor atmospheric imbalance in the officers' quarters that required investigation. But instead of fixing the problem, Marcus used it as cover to install his own monitoring equipment. Commander Vasquez was in her office adjacent to the Admiral's quarters, working late as she often did. Marcus could see her through the transparent aluminum partition, reviewing tactical reports that she would soon transmit to the hegemony fleet. She looked completely human, but Marcus knew that appearances could be deceiving. Marcus waited until the night shift began, and most of the senior staff had retired to their quarters. Then he activated a device he had built from salvaged components, an electromagnetic pulse generator that would briefly disable the ship's internal sensors in a small area. He would have only minutes before backup systems came online. Moving through the darkened corridors of the flagship, Marcus made his way to Admiral Thorne's quarters. The door was locked with military-grade security, but Marcus had been bypassing locks since he was 12 years old. His improvised tools made quick work of the electronic systems. Inside the Admiral's quarters, Marcus began his search. The quantum relay would be small and well hidden, designed to appear as part of the ship's normal equipment. Marcus methodically examined every device in the room. Using his scanner to detect the telltale quantum signatures, he found the relay hidden inside the Admiral's personal computer terminal, disguised as a routine data processing chip. It was a masterpiece of covert engineering. Completely undetectable without specialized equipment, Marcus carefully removed the device and replaced it with a modified component of his own design. The replacement relay would appear to function normally, but Marcus had programmed it to do something the infiltrators would never expect. Instead of coordinating their activities, it would feed them false information about the timing and nature of the hegemony attack. But Marcus's real stroke of genius was what he did next. Using components from the captured relay, he built a transmitter that could mimic the infiltrators' quantum signatures. He was going to impersonate them, sending false orders that would reveal their identities to Alliance security. Marcus activated his transmitter just as he heard footsteps in the corridor outside. Someone was coming, and there was nowhere to hide in the Admiral's sparse quarters. Marcus quickly sealed his equipment inside a maintenance panel and prepared to face whatever consequences his discovery might bring. The door opened to reveal Admiral Thorne himself, returning from a late meeting with his senior staff. The old warrior's eyes widened in surprise as he saw Marcus crouched beside his computer terminal. "Son," the Admiral said quietly, "you'd better have a damn good explanation for being in my quarters." Marcus stood slowly, his mind racing as he tried to decide how much to reveal. The Admiral might be trustworthy, but Marcus couldn't be certain that their conversation wouldn't be overheard by enemy agents. "Sir," Marcus said carefully, "I've been tracking some unusual signals throughout the fleet. I believe we have a security problem." Admiral Thorne studied Marcus for a long moment, then walked to his desk and activated a privacy field that would prevent electronic surveillance. "Talk," he said simply. Marcus took a deep breath and began to explain everything he had discovered. The infiltrators, the sabotage, the planned capture of the fleet, all of it. He showed the Admiral his scanner readings and the evidence he had gathered over the past weeks. To his credit, Admiral Thorne listened without interruption, his weathered face growing grimmer with each revelation. When Marcus finished, the Admiral was quiet for several minutes. "How long do we have?" Thorne finally asked. "Based on the communication patterns, I estimate 12 hours before the attack begins," Marcus replied. "Maybe less." The Admiral nodded grimly. "Then we need to move fast. But we can't use normal channels. If your chief of staff is compromised, then standard procedures are useless." Marcus felt a surge of relief that the Admiral believed him. "I have a plan, sir, but it's going to require taking some significant risks." Admiral Thorne smiled for the first time since Marcus had begun his explanation. "Son, I've been taking risks since before you were born. What do you need?" Marcus outlined his strategy. Using his fake transmitter, he would send orders to all the infiltrators simultaneously, instructing them to activate their sabotage early. The premature activation would reveal their positions to Alliance security while also triggering response protocols that Marcus had secretly installed in the ship's systems. "It's like setting off all the traps at once," Marcus explained. "The infiltrators will expose themselves and we'll be ready for them." The Admiral considered the plan for several minutes. "It's audacious," he finally said, "and it might just work. But if you're wrong about any of this, we'll be arresting innocent officers based on the word of a maintenance worker." Marcus met the Admiral's gaze steadily, Sir, I've been wrong about a lot of things in my life, but not about this. Admiral Thorne activated his personal communication system and began issuing carefully worded orders to trusted officers throughout the fleet. Within an hour, security teams would be in position to respond when Marcus triggered his trap. As the Admiral worked, Marcus made final preparations for what would either be the Alliance's salvation or its destruction. In less than 12 hours, the Hegemony fleet would arrive expecting to capture a defenseless enemy. Instead, they would find a force that was ready for them, led by a man who had learned that sometimes the best way to be noticed was to remain invisible until the perfect moment to strike. At precisely 0600 hours, Marcus activated his transmitter and sent the false activation orders to every infiltrator in the fleet. The message was simple: execute Protocol 7 immediately. Do not wait for confirmation. The response was immediate and devastating. Across 12 ships, Hegemony agents began their sabotage operation 6 hours ahead of schedule. Weapon systems started failing, shield generators began overloading, and navigation computers crashed throughout the fleet. But Admiral Thorne's security teams were ready. As each system failure occurred, they traced it back to its source and found the infiltrator responsible. On the destroyer Vigilant, the weapons officer was arrested while trying to input malicious code. On the cruiser Independence, the chief engineer was captured with his hands literally inside the main power coupling. The most dramatic arrest occurred on the flagship itself. Commander Vasquez had been in the middle of transmitting fleet positions to the Hegemony when Marcus's false signal arrived. Believing that the attack had begun early, she activated a virus that was supposed to cripple the ship's command systems. Instead, she triggered a security protocol that Marcus had secretly installed, which immediately isolated her workstation and alerted Admiral Thorne. Security officers found Vasquez frantically trying to destroy evidence of her activities. Her human appearance was revealed to be an illusion, created by sophisticated biomimetic technology. Underneath the disguise was something that had once been human, but was now more machine than flesh. Fascinating, said Dr. Chen, the fleet's chief xenobiologist, as he examined Vasquez in the brig. The Hegemony has learned to create near-perfect human replicas. If not for your detection methods, Marcus, we might never have identified her. But Marcus wasn't celebrating yet. He had neutralized the infiltrators, but the main Hegemony fleet was still coming. His scanner detected massive hyperspace distortions at the edge of the system, indicating that dozens of enemy ships were about to arrive. Admiral, Marcus reported from his position in the flagship's communication center, I'm reading hyperspace signatures. The Hegemony fleet will be here in less than an hour. Admiral Thorne nodded grimly. How many ships? Marcus checked his readings and felt his heart sink. Over 100 contacts, sir. 3 times the size of our fleet. The Admiral activated the fleet-wide communication system. All ships, this is Admiral Thorne. Battle stations. The enemy is coming, and they're bringing everything they have. Throughout the Centauri defense line, Alliance ships prepared for what many believed would be their final battle. But Marcus realized that they still had one advantage the enemy wasn't expecting. The Hegemony didn't know that their infiltrators had been captured. They were still planning to coordinate their attack with sabotage from within. Sir, Marcus said, I have an idea. What if we let them think their plan is working? Admiral Thorne raised an eyebrow. Explain, Marcus outlined his strategy. Using the captured communication equipment, they could impersonate the infiltrators and send false reports to the Hegemony fleet. They could make the enemy believe that Alliance ships were crippled and defenseless when they were actually fully operational. It's a deception operation, Marcus explained. We make them think they're walking into an easy victory when they're actually sailing into a trap. The Admiral smiled grimly. I like it. But can you pull it off? The Hegemony will be suspicious if the reports don't match what they expect. Marcus had been studying the captured infiltrators' communication protocols for hours. I think so, sir. The reports have to be believable but not too detailed. We want them confident but not overconfident. Over the next 30 minutes, Marcus sent a series of carefully crafted messages to the approaching Hegemony fleet. He reported weapon systems offline, shields failing, and command structures in chaos. Each message was designed to reinforce the enemy's belief that their infiltration had succeeded. The deception worked better than Marcus had dared hope. When the Hegemony fleet emerged from hyperspace, They deployed in an attack formation designed to capture rather than destroy. Their ships approached slowly and methodically, expecting to face minimal resistance. Admiral Thorne waited until the enemy fleet was committed to their attack vector before giving the order that would change the course of the war. All ships, this is the Admiral. Execute Operation Phantom. Show them what happens when they underestimate the Alliance. The Alliance fleet erupted into action with a coordination and ferocity that caught the hegemony completely off guard. Ships that were supposed to be crippled launched devastating salvos of missiles and energy beams. Squadrons that should have been scattered flew in perfect formation, striking at the enemy's weak points with surgical precision. Marcus watched the battle unfold from the flagship's tactical center, his scanner tracking the movements of both fleets. The hegemony ships were trying to adapt to the unexpected resistance, but their collective consciousness was struggling to process the contradictory information it was receiving. Their coordination is breaking down, Marcus reported to Admiral Thorne. The collective can't reconcile what they're seeing with what their agents reported. But the hegemony had one final surprise. As their fleet began to falter, several of their largest ships activated a weapon that Alliance intelligence had never seen before. Massive energy projectors created tears in space itself, forming artificial black holes that began consuming everything around them. Gravitational weapons, breathed Dr. Chen, who was monitoring the battle from the science station. They're using controlled singularities as weapons. The artificial black holes grew rapidly, threatening to consume Alliance and hegemony ships alike. It was a desperate gambit, the kind of weapon that could destroy both fleets if used incorrectly. Marcus studied the energy readings from the gravitational weapons and realized that they had a fatal flaw. The singularities were held in place by magnetic field generators, and those generators had to be constantly adjusted to maintain stability. If the adjustment signals could be disrupted, the weapons would become uncontrollable. Admiral, Marcus said urgently, I can stop those weapons, but I need to get close to their fleet command ship. Admiral Thorne looked at the tactical display, where the artificial black holes were growing larger by the minute. How close? Boarding range, sir. I need to physically access their control systems. The Admiral was quiet for a moment, then nodded. Do it. Take whatever you need. Marcus gathered his equipment and made his way to the hangar bay, where a stealth shuttle was being prepared for launch. As he climbed aboard, he realized that this mission would be even more dangerous than his first infiltration. The hegemony fleet was fully alert now, and their command ship would be heavily defended. But Marcus had learned something important during his time fighting the hegemony. They expected their enemies to behave logically, to make rational tactical decisions based on available information. What they didn't expect was someone crazy enough to fly directly into the middle of their fleet, while artificial black holes were consuming everything around them. As Marcus launched from the flagship and set course for the hegemony command ship, he smiled grimly. The enemy was about to learn that their third mistake had been assuming that humans always acted rationally. Sometimes, Marcus reflected as he flew through a battlefield where physics itself had become a weapon, the most effective strategy was the one that made no sense at all. Marcus's stealth shuttle raced through the chaotic battlefield, weaving between energy beams and debris, while the artificial black holes continued to grow. The gravitational distortions were playing havoc with his navigation systems, but Marcus had learned to trust his instincts more than his instruments. The hegemony command ship loomed ahead like a mechanical mountain, its hull bristling with weapons and defensive systems. But Marcus noticed something that the ship's designers had overlooked. The gravitational weapons were creating massive energy discharges that interfered with their own sensor arrays. In the electromagnetic chaos, a small stealth shuttle was effectively invisible. Marcus brought his craft alongside the command ship's hull and activated the cutting tools he had taken from the captured infiltrator. The alien technology sliced through the hegemony armor, creating an opening just large enough for him to squeeze through. Inside the ship, Marcus found himself in a nightmare landscape that made his previous infiltration look simple by comparison. The command vessel was enormous, a floating city of organic technology and cybernetic systems. Worse, it was filled with hegemony soldiers, beings that had once been from dozens of different species but were now unified in their mechanical augmentation. Marcus moved through the ship's corridors like a ghost, using maintenance shafts and service tunnels to avoid detection. His destination was the central command center, where the gravitational weapons were being controlled. But as he made his way deeper into the vessel, he began to understand the true scope of what he was facing. The hegemony wasn't just using gravitational weapons, they were preparing to use them on a massive scale. Marcus discovered weapon bays filled with gravitational bombs, devices that could create permanent black holes capable of consuming entire star systems. The artificial singularities in the current battle were just a test of the technology. The realization hit Marcus like a physical blow. The hegemony wasn't just trying to conquer the galaxy, they were preparing to reshape it entirely. Any system that resisted them would be consumed by artificial black holes, leaving nothing but empty space for the collective to expand into. Marcus reached the command center and found it guarded by dozens of cybernetic warriors. But he also found something else, a massive central processor that controlled not just the gravitational weapons but the collective consciousness itself. It was the hegemony's greatest strength, and Marcus realized their greatest vulnerability. The processor was organic in nature, a vast brain-like structure that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns. It was beautiful in an alien way, but Marcus could see the chains of neural pathways that connected it to every hegemony ship in the fleet. If he could damage it, he could disrupt their entire coordination network. But getting to the processor meant going through the guards, and Marcus was vastly outnumbered. He needed a distraction, something that would draw their attention away from their most vital system. Marcus activated his modified transmitter and began broadcasting on every hegemony frequency simultaneously. But instead of sending data, he transmitted something else: music. Specifically, he broadcast a recording of Earth's most chaotic and unpredictable musical form, improvisational jazz. The effect on the collective consciousness was immediate and devastating. The hegemony mind was designed for order and coordination, not for the spontaneous creativity and controlled chaos of human music. The jazz recording created cognitive dissonance that rippled through their neural networks like a virus. Guards throughout the command center stopped in their tracks, their cybernetic implants sparking as they struggled to process the alien musical patterns. Some began to convulse, their enhanced nervous systems overloading from the cognitive strain. Others simply shut down, their consciousness retreating deeper into the collective to escape the musical chaos. Marcus didn't waste the opportunity. He sprinted across the command center and reached the central processor just as the guards began to recover from their musical assault. The organic computer was warm to the touch, its surface covered in neural interfaces that pulsed with electronic rhythms. Marcus connected his transmitter directly to the processor and began uploading something that would change the course of galactic history. It wasn't a virus or a weapon. It was a simple human concept that the collective consciousness had never encountered before: doubt. Marcus's upload contained thousands of human philosophical questions, moral dilemmas and ethical paradoxes. What is the nature of consciousness? Can a collective mind truly understand individual experience? Is unity worth the price of diversity? Each question was designed to create uncertainty in minds that had never experienced it before. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Throughout the hegemony fleet, collective consciousness began to fracture as individual minds started questioning their participation in the collective. Some ships stopped fighting entirely as their crews grappled with newfound uncertainty. Others turned their weapons on their own allies as different factions emerged within the collective. But Marcus's greatest achievement was what happened to the gravitational weapons. As the collective's coordination broke down, the precise magnetic field adjustments needed to control the artificial black holes became erratic. The singularities began to destabilize, collapsing in on themselves instead of growing larger. Marcus watched through the command center's displays as the hegemony fleet tore itself apart. Ships that had operated in perfect unity for centuries were now firing on each other as their crews struggled with concepts of individualism and free will. The collective consciousness that had been their greatest strength had become their greatest weakness. But Marcus's work wasn't finished. The central processor was still functional, still trying to reassert control over the fragmenting collective. Marcus knew that he had to destroy it completely to ensure that the hegemony could never reunify. He pulled out his plasma cutter and began severing the neural pathways that connected the processor to the fleet. Each cut sent shockwaves through the collective consciousness, further fragmenting their unity. Some of the cybernetic guards had recovered enough to notice what he was doing, but they moved sluggishly, their augmented minds still struggling with the philosophical chaos he had unleashed. As Marcus cut the final connection, the central processor let out a sound that was part electronic scream and part organic death rattle. The massive brain-like structure began to collapse in on itself, its bioluminescent patterns fading to darkness. Throughout the hegemony fleet, the effects were immediate. Ships that had been firing on each other suddenly went dark as their collective consciousness disappeared entirely. Some vessels began broadcasting surrender signals, their crews finally free to make their own decisions for the first time in decades. Marcus felt the command ship shudder around him as its own systems began to fail. Without the central processor to coordinate them, the various cybernetic systems throughout the vessel were shutting down or working at cross purposes. He had minutes, maybe less, before the ship became completely uninhabitable. But as Marcus made his way back toward his entry point, he encountered something unexpected. A group of hegemony soldiers had cornered him in one of the main corridors, but they weren't attacking. Instead, they were kneeling, their cybernetic implants flickering weakly. We remember," one of them said in a voice that was more human than machine. "We remember who we were before." Marcus realized that his philosophical virus had done more than just disrupt the collective. It had awakened the suppressed personalities of the beings who had been absorbed into the hegemony. They were remembering their original identities, their individual thoughts and feelings that had been submerged beneath the collective consciousness. "Help us," another soldier pleaded. "We don't know how to be individuals anymore." Marcus looked at these former enemies and saw not monsters but victims. The hegemony had stolen their identities, their free will, their very sense of self. Now that they were free, they were lost and confused, like children who had forgotten how to think for themselves. "Stay together," Marcus told them as the ship continued to shake around them. "Help each other remember who you used to be. The Alliance will help you, but you have to survive long enough to escape this ship." Marcus showed them the way to the escape pods and then continued toward his own shuttle. As he flew away from the dying command ship, he watched dozens of pods launching from hegemony vessels throughout the fleet. The collective consciousness was truly dead, and its former components were choosing freedom over unity. The battle was over, but Marcus knew that the real work was just beginning. The galaxy now faced the challenge of integrating millions of former hegemony drones back into free society. It would take decades, maybe centuries, to undo the damage that the collective had done. But as Marcus returned to the Alliance fleet, he felt something he had never experienced before: pride in his own accomplishments. The invisible maintenance worker had not only saved his own people, but had liberated an entire galaxy from the tyranny of forced unity. Admiral Thorne was waiting for him in the hangar bay when Marcus landed. The old warrior's face showed a mixture of relief and awe as he watched the young human climb out of his shuttle. "Son," the Admiral said quietly, "I've been in this business for a long time, and I've never seen anything like what you just accomplished. You didn't just win a battle, you ended a war." Marcus looked out at the stars beyond the hangar bay, where former hegemony ships were already beginning to form new alliances based on choice rather than compulsion. "The galaxy would never be the same, and neither would he. I just gave them a choice, sir," Marcus said simply. "Sometimes that's all it takes to change everything." The Admiral smiled and placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Welcome to the visible world, son. I have a feeling the galaxy is going to be hearing a lot more from Marcus Chen." For the first time in his life, Marcus didn't mind the attention. He had learned that being noticed wasn't always a bad thing, especially when you had something important to say. And he had a feeling that the galaxy's former slaves would need someone to speak for them as they learned to use their newfound freedom. The enemy had ignored him, and that had been their fatal mistake. But Marcus knew that his real work was just beginning.